Have you ever stopped to think if the history you learned back in school was really the whole story? Well, today we're diving into a source that makes a bold claim that the standard history of India has been deliberately twisted and a much older, more complex story is now finally coming to light.
And that's really the central question our source material wants us to grapple with. Is the history we've always accepted as fact actually an incomplete version of events? Or, as the source suggests, maybe even an intentionally altered one?
So, according to the source we're examining, this famous quote from Macaulay wasn't just some casual proposal. No, this was the actual blueprint for what it calls the colonization of the mind. The idea was, if you can rewrite a nation's past, you can reshape its entire identity.
All right, so let's get into the first big premise. Our source kicks off with this really powerful idea that the history of India wasn't just recorded poorly, but was systematically re-engineered to benefit colonial rule, basically to create a sense of inferiority.
You see, the source puts forward this crucial concept: control a people's story of their past. Decide who the heroes are, which events get the spotlight, and which ones get totally erased, and you have a massive amount of control over their present and their future.
So let's move on to the first major distortion the source really dives into, and it goes right for the jugular. The very origin of Indian civilization itself, a story that many of us were taught as fact.
Now this is where it gets fascinating. The source argues that the Aryan invasion theory, this idea that outsiders came in and conquered the native people, was basically a colonial invention, and it counters that story with recent scientific evidence like genetic studies, which it claims show absolutely no proof of a big invasion, but instead suggest a continuous indigenous civilization going back for thousands of years.
And this slide really lays out the source's case with a simple chronological puzzle. It basically asks, if the so-called Aryans showed up in 1500 BCE, how on earth could they have written beautiful hymns praising a huge, powerful river that, according to geologists, had already dried up and vanished 400 years before they even got there? It just doesn't add up.
From there, the source shifts gears from ancient origins to ancient achievements. It argues that a really rich history of advanced, practical science was pretty much just ignored or even erased from the official record.
Take wood steel, for instance. According to our source, this wasn't just any old metal. This was a world-famous technology, a high-tech export that was used to make some of the best swords in history. And here's the kicker. The source claims its production was actively shut down by the British just to protect their own steel industry.
Then you have medicine. The source points to this incredible ancient encyclopedia of surgery. I mean, think about that for a second. We're talking detailed instructions for things like plastic surgery and removing cataracts, complete with pictures of over 120 different surgical tools, all written down more than 2,500 years ago.
And in math, the sutra makes this absolutely startling claim that could rewrite the history of science. It says that the foundational building blocks of calculus, the stuff we all learn was discovered by Newton and Leibniz, were actually figured out in India centuries before they were known in Europe.
Okay, next up, the source takes on a very common perception. This idea of a passive India, a civilization that was just constantly being ruled by outsiders and didn't really put up much of a fight.
But the source presents a completely different story, one filled with fierce, long, and often successful resistance. From the Ahoms in the east who defeated the Mughals 17 times to the Marathas in the west, it argues that these incredible stories are usually just pushed to the footnotes, which creates a totally skewed and frankly inaccurate view of the past.
And this is a really critical point the source makes, citing a 1956 admission by Clement Attlee. That's the British Prime Minister who actually signed off on India's independence. When he was asked why the British left, Attlee apparently said that the role of nonviolence was minimal. The main reason? The armed mutinies inspired by Subhash Chandra Bose.
So finally, the source brings us right up to the present day. It frames what's happening now not just as politics, but as part of a much bigger cultural and historical reawakening.
This table does a great job of pulling everything together. It's a quick summary of the core arguments we've been talking about, putting the conventional story right next to the alternative one the source presents. It's a huge shift from seeing India as a passive place where history happened to it to seeing it as an active and resilient civilization.
At the end of the day, the ultimate takeaway here is a fundamental change in perspective. The source is really urging us to stop seeing modern India as a young country born in 1947, and instead to see it as one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations, one that is now waking up and taking back its own story.
And that leaves us with a really provocative final thought. If history truly does shape a nation's identity, then what kind of future is being built on the foundations of this reclaimed past? According to this source, what we're witnessing isn't just a simple rewriting of history books, it might just be the charting of a whole new course for 1/6 of humanity.